Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new episode with MarkTech. An episode I definitely didn't think I would be doing today, but the rumors seem to be true. Now, what is a little bit untypical is the release schedule, because with a press release on a Monday, today is March 4th, Apple just confirmed that we are getting updates to the 13 and 15-inch MacBook Air models, now getting the M3 chip, which we have known from the 14-inch MacBook Pro, faster Wi-Fi. Obviously, Wi-Fi 6E has been propagating through Apple's lineups for quite a while, and it's fixing a long-standing shortcoming of the base M series processors in Apple's lineup, and that is that they now feature support for up to 2 external displays, all of that while still offering 18 hours of battery life. So very exciting update at a slightly surprising time, and I'm very grateful to see that. Let's get into it. Now, before we go into more tech spec stuff, let me first break down the actual lineup for you. At first, you have to consider that at $999 you no longer get the old wedge design M1 MacBook Air, which is obviously quite old at this point, but you now get the M2 version, which obviously improves the value proposition. At $1099 and $1299 respectively, you get the new base versions of the 13 and 15-inch MacBook Airs with the M3 chip. So the lineup actually just moves one processor upwards regardless of the price you're looking at. $999 moves from M1 to M2, and $1099 and $1299 move from M2 to M3. Now, what hasn't changed though is pretty much everything else. You still get your 4 color choices between Midnight, Starlight, Space Gray and Silver, and you get to pay Apple's egregious prices if you want more storage and more memory. The base version at $1099 comes with 8GB of unified memory and 256GB of SSD storage. Thus far, it's unknown if this base configuration will suffer the same slow storage problem as the M2 version did, because the base configuration has fewer storage modules and therefore lower storage speed than the upgraded models. So just for that reason, or the potential of that problem, and the fact that 512GB is very likely a more usable storage amount these days, I highly recommend you get at least 512GB of storage. This obviously will cost you $200 more, but for that money you also get a better power adapter. It goes from 30 watts to 35 watts, but it's also a dual USB-C port compact power adapter that is gallium nitride based. It's obviously not a huge deal, but it adds like $10-15 of value, I would argue. And then beyond that, you also get the fully enabled M3 processor that goes from 8-core GPU version to a 10-core GPU version, and then if you pay another $200, you get 16GB of unified memory. Obviously, there are a million YouTube videos on whether you actually need 16GB. I personally encourage people to get it. Yes, $1499 is obviously significantly more expensive than $1099, but I promise you that this configuration will last you significantly longer in terms of performance, in terms of storage, and obviously you will have some niceties like that upgraded power adapter. And with the 15-inch version, it's actually just the same, but a little bit better value, I would argue. At first, you have to pay $200 more across the board to get the same RAM and storage configurations, but there are some goodies here as well to consider. First of all, the 15-inch model across the board comes with the fully enabled M3 processor. That means 10-core GPU versions without paying extra, and you get the faster dual USB-C port adapter. Granted, that's partially because the 15-inch MacBook Air model obviously has a larger battery and needs it, but the base configuration still is 8GB of unified memory, 256 gigs of storage, again with the same storage speed considerations. I will keep you updated if there are tests to see if maybe those problems have been solved, But as I've also said before, 512 gigabytes will definitely not have those issues, and it's a much more usable storage amount these days. And yes, if you want to make it as future-proof as you want, 16 gigabytes is far better in my eyes than 8 gigabytes. Obviously, all those models scale further upwards. You can get it with 1 or even 2 terabytes of storage, and you can get up to 24 gigabytes of unified memory. I don't really recommend those kinds of upgrades, because usually once you make those kinds of upgrades, you're way closer to the pricing of the MacBook Pro models, and those obviously have some other improvements like ProMotion screens, even better like speakers, stuff like that. So I highly recommend you stick with basically those pre-builds if you want to get the best value out of the MacBook Air. For us to really understand the value proposition of the new MacBook Air models, we need to compare it all with the previous generation, the M2 version, and the M3 version of the 14-inch MacBook Air, which is obviously somewhat more premium, but it's not quite as premium as the M3 Pro and M3 Max versions, and they all sit very close to each other in terms of pricing once you consider higher storage and RAM configurations. Obviously $999 for the M2 MacBook Air, $1099 for the M3 MacBook Air, and a whole lot more for the 14-inch version of the MacBook Pro with M3 at $1599. However, you have to consider that this does come with 512 gigabytes of base storage, though it still somehow only comes with 8 gigabytes of unified memory. So there's a lot we have to consider here. Now, to me, the most important consideration you have to make while getting one of those MacBook models is the screen. Once you adjust for storage and RAM needs, you're very close in price, and then you have to ask yourself, is $200 to $300 more worth it for me, and can I even pay that, of course, to get a much better screen? Because obviously you move from a 13.6-inch Liquid Retina display to a 14.2-inch Liquid Retina XDR display. Now, you can get a larger screen on the 15-inch MacBook Air, but that 14-inch screen is incredibly nice. It obviously gives you much higher HDR brightness because it's a mini LED panel. It gives you even higher SDR brightness at 600 nits versus 500 nits on the MacBook Air. And above all else, it's a ProMotion screen with up to 120 Hz. As somebody who has had a 14-inch MacBook Pro for years now, I highly recommend, if you have the money, if it really doesn't break the bank for you, consider getting this for the display, because this will really be a game-changing experience, especially if you like to watch movies and TV shows on your laptop. And of course, if you're working in more brighter lit environments, the 600 nits of SDR peak brightness is a nice to have versus 500 nits. Next, you have to consider, obviously, your processing needs. And this is where I have to tell you that the 13-inch MacBook Air with M2 really doesn't make much sense to me if it's only $100 cheaper than the M3. In fact, that already didn't make sense to me when the M2 was only $100 more expensive than the M1, right? Especially since you also had like the older design to consider here. But the M3 is a nice upgrade over M2. So really, for those $100 more, I highly recommend you basically automatically get the M3 version of the MacBook Air. However, then we have to consider, well, between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, they have the same processor. Now, on the base configuration of the 13-inch, you do start with an 8-core GPU version, a bin-down processor basically, while on the 14-inch, across the board, you get the fully enabled 10-core GPU version. However, if you pay obviously a little more for more storage on the MacBook Air M3, or if you just get the 15-inch version of it, then you also do get the fully enabled M3 processor. So if you really have very basic like browsing, email needs, I think that even the bin down GPU version is nice. You really don't have to be afraid of getting it. Obviously, you do have to be afraid of maybe the 256 gigabytes that it comes with in the base configuration. But there's another consideration that you have to make here, and that is that the M3 chip on the MacBook Pro 14-inch is actively cooled. There is a fan inside the MacBook Pro. There isn't one neither in the 13-inch model nor in the 15-inch. Now, the 15-inch has the advantage of larger size, so it can better dissipate heat over a larger surface area, but the 13-inch has already been found to be quite extreme in its thermal throttling on the M2 version, because Apple really cheaps out on like the cooling structures inside the MacBook Air. So I really have to say, if you also want like the 10-core GPU version, either consider getting the 15-inch version of the MacBook Air, or just without any worries get the 14-inch MacBook Pro. As I said time and time again, once you go up to higher RAM and storage configurations, the price difference in terms of percentage really starts to shrink, and then it really doesn't make sense to get especially the older M2 version of the MacBook Air, but even the M3 version with 24 gigabytes of memory or 2 terabytes of storage doesn't really make sense. Those are pro specs in my eyes. Either get it on the 14-inch MacBook Pro with M3, or even better, get it on a version that has the M3 Pro or M3 Max chip. What is a more direct, like, prosumer or regular consumer benefit is the longer battery life on the 14-inch MacBook Pro. 22 hours versus 18 hours might not be a game-changing difference, but if you're really in a hurry, if you really need just that extra hour of battery life, that might be something that the 14-inch MacBook Pro gives you, while the MacBook Air does not. You also don't get extra battery life technically if you get the 15-inch version, at least according to Apple's estimates. Most real-world tests though show you that the 15-inch version does have effectively longer battery life than the 13-inch version. So consider at least that. After that, we come to very similar specs across the board, and this is where, once again, the M2 version really doesn't make sense to me, because you save $100 for a device that most likely will not last you as long as the M3 version, and you get, obviously, the M3 chip with all its niceties, 100 gigabytes of memory bandwidth. Granted, it is the same as on the M2, but you also get the upgraded neural engine, you get support for hardware accelerated ray tracing, you do get a faster GPU, even though it's the same core configuration as on the M2 chip, it's still faster, and the same obviously goes for the CPU with 4 performance cores, 4 efficiency cores, and you also have improved media engine capabilities, which now do support AV1 decode on the M3 processor. So quite some nice new things. You might consider, well, how much do you need all those things, and how much money are they actually extra worth to you? However, I would have to say, given that the price difference between here and here is only $100, I really cannot recommend you get the M2 version, and certainly not a higher spec version, at which point you cross the pricing of the base configuration of the M3 13-inch MacBook Air. So yeah, of course, as I said before, you do have to think about the M3 being actively cooled here. So across the board, even though the core configurations might be the same depending on the actual like storage and RAM configuration that you have, this will give you better sustained performance, as I've already mentioned before. In terms of size and weight, I really will have to be a stick in the mud and say none of this really matters. Yes, the MacBook Pro is thicker and heavier and slightly larger. To me, the difference between 2.7 pounds and 3.4 pounds really shouldn't prevent you from getting the nicer device. So unless you really have some extreme considerations to make when it comes to size, don't let this be a hindrance to you in any way. Obviously, camera needs are obviously met equally on those devices with a 1080p FaceTime HD camera. Now, you do have to consider different speakers and more higher quality microphones on the MacBook Pro. However, I honestly have to say, this really probably won't change your real world experience that much. Now, you do have a 4-speaker sound system on the 13-inch MacBook Air and a high fidelity 6-speaker system on the 14-inch MacBook Pro, so there will be a difference here. However, once you step up to the 15-inch version of the MacBook Air, this is where you do get a 6-speaker system as well. Now, the microphone arrays, yes, they are nicer on the MacBook Pro. However, even as somebody who does obviously a lot of voice recording for my YouTube channel, I do have an external mic, because as much as Apple might want to call them studio quality, they really aren't in real life. What you do have to consider about ports in general, though, is you do get an HDMI port here that supports multi-channel audio output. So if this is an audio need that you might have, and we will talk about other ports as well, this can be a reason to get the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Now, speaking of those ports, yes, you do get the HDMI port, which obviously doesn't give you just multi-channel audio output, but it does also give you video output, which is quite a nice thing to have, and you get an SDXC card slot. Now, you do have only 2 Thunderbolt USB 4 ports, and then obviously MagSafe for charging across the M2 and M3 version of the MacBook Air, but as I've said before, and Apple even outlined in their press release, if you close the lid on the new MacBook Air, you now get support for 2 external monitors versus previously on the 13-inch and the 15-inch M2 MacBook Air, you simply didn't have that ability. You could only output your screen to 1 external monitor, regardless if you have your lid closed or not. Now, one improvement over the M2 that the M3 version of the MacBook Air also has is now the support for much faster Wi-Fi 6E that is effectively 2 times faster, and now puts it in line with the capabilities of the 14-inch MacBook Pro. However, obviously, if you consider all of this combined as connectivity, then yeah, obviously the MacBook Pro wins with its addition of an HDMI and an SDXC card slot. Now, the last thing I want to share with you is basically who this device is aimed at, because in typical fashion, YouTube videos, websites will focus on, well, how much faster is M3 MacBook Air versus M2 MacBook Air, right? And should you upgrade from the last gen model? Well, let me make one thing very clear. No, you shouldn't. For one, it's incredibly wasteful. And the other thing is, even Apple doesn't really want you to, or at least they don't believe you will, because on their website, they compare it against the fastest Intel-based MacBook Air, for which they claim the new M3 MacBook Air is up to 13 times faster, and then versus the MacBook Air with an M1 chip, not with M2, they do compare it favorably against and say that the M3 MacBook Air is 1.6 times faster. Now, obviously, if you really want like some scientific breakdown of M3 performance, there are a ton of videos on that, and I've done that in the past on this channel as well. It would sit somewhere between 1 and 1.6x here. You do have also M3 with its superior capabilities like hardware accelerated ray tracing. However, if you have M2, and I would argue for most people who have M1, this is still not worth it. This is for people who are still holdouts, who still have Intel-based MacBooks. It doesn't even have to be an Air. This will be way faster than most MacBook Pros with Intel chips ever made. So I really, really want you to go against the grain here. Really don't be in this controversial mindset of, well, is it 10 or is it 15% faster than the last gen? People who have the last gen really shouldn't be getting it. In fact, this is why we compared the M3 version of the MacBook Air versus the M2. Not because because it is its predecessor necessarily, but because technically the M3 MacBook Air is more of a premium version of the M2 MacBook Air. Yes, sure, of course it is its successor in a very, very direct interpretation of that, but they are sold simultaneously. Their price difference is relatively small, so Apple clearly doesn't see them really hardcore competing against each other, more like complementing. And this is why I highly encourage you to always stay calm, never buy into like the big controversies online, because believe me, if there is something to be controversial about, I will pick up on that and I'll cover that because I need the views. You don't need that in your life. You need a calm and quiet. So if you want this MacBook Air, I've outlined what you should consider against it, where I've said the M2, if you're buying it at Apple's prices, really doesn't make much sense. If you really want something nicer, then the MacBook Pro comes into play. However, if your budget is like hard capped at like $1,500 or even $1,400, then consider getting it or the 13 or the 15-inch version of the M3 MacBook Air, and then you will have a very nice device that will last you a long time. I also gave you some considerations that you should make when it comes to storage and RAM, and then obviously please don't forget, if you have some kinds of discounts, whether you're a veteran or you're in some kind of educational facility or you're a student yourself, then please activate it, because those 10% discounts usually make MacBooks a really, really good value. And then all my other points for comparison still stands. I think this is a not very exciting but good to have update, because I believe in the Rene Ritchie motto, which is that technology should be basically like bread, right? If you go into a bakery, you want it to be as fresh as possible. And with technology, if you buy a piece of tech, you want it to be as upgraded as possible so it can last you for as long as possible in the future. This is why I do encourage you to get an M3 based MacBook, whether it's a MacBook Air, whether it's a MacBook Pro. I think you will be very happy with it. And yes, Apple's RAM and storage pricing remains egregious, but at least it's something we are mostly used to. So I think most people who really have higher end needs probably don't consider the base configurations these days at all. And to be fully honest, I believe this was always Apple's plan, to effectively make the base configuration the $1,300 version and not the $1,099 version. So those are my last words on this MacBook Air. Again, some nice performance upgrades, faster Wi-Fi, really nice to have two monitor support, two external monitor support to be precise, versus previously only one. This was a limitation that has been quite a big one, I believe, on the base M series chips. A lot of people have complained about it, especially a lot of people that come from the Windows realm of devices and even older Intel based MacBooks. So this will be mostly a fix. Yes, you have to consider that you do have to close your lid in order to drive two external monitors, but I do believe that this is still a better solution than not having this capability at all. Of course, if you also have a faster Wi-Fi router at home that does support Wi-Fi 6E, this will also be more future-proof than an only Wi-Fi 6 device. So we went into a lot of detail into storage, RAM, pricing, value, performance, a little less so, comparisons to its other brothers in its lineup, and I hope it really helped you. Over the next week, or this week to be more precise, I expect Apple to still introduce new devices, probably a new iPad Pro, probably new accessories for that iPad Pro, like an Apple Pencil 3, a Magic Keyboard. So please stay tuned. I really want to get back into the groove of making content. I do have a live stream for you to watch from yesterday where I covered LTT's review of Apple Vision Pro, and I also want to cover eventually the Apple Vision Pro review by Front Page Tech, but as you see, I do have a lot of other stuff to cover in the meantime. Thank you guys, this was a big pleasure for me to cover a new Apple product again. I apologize for the longer hiatus, for those who have missed me apologizing in my live stream. I'll see you guys next time. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.